In this first lesson, we'll lay the foundation for creating and manipulating shapes. The following lessons will build on this foundation. Let's create a new motion project using the 720 preset at 23.98 frames per second and a 10-second duration. These settings aren't critical. Feel free to choose your own settings. Let's press Shift-Z to fit the canvas to the window. There are multiple ways to create shapes in motion, and once you create a shape, there are all kinds of ways to manipulate them, add effects to them, and animate them. We'll start by creating shapes with the Shape tools in the toolbar. Click the Rectangle Shape tool in the toolbar, or press the letter R to select it. The pointer changes to crosshairs. Also, the Heads-Up display, or HUD, now contains some new options. If you don't see the HUD, click this button, or press the F7 key. Let's start with the Fill checked and set to white, the Outline unchecked, so the color doesn't matter, nor does the width, and set the roundness to 0. Now click and drag in the canvas. If you hold down the Shift key while dragging, the rectangle will be constrained to a perfect square. Once you release the mouse, a new shape layer appears in the Layers list, in the Mini Timeline, and in the Timeline. Note that the Rectangle tool is still active, as indicated by the crosshairs. If you try to adjust your new shape in the HUD, for example, change the color, you'll see that nothing happens. Because the Rectangle tool is still active, any changes you make in the HUD will only affect the next rectangle that you draw. To modify the current rectangle, click the Select Transform tool in the toolbar, or just press the Escape key. Now use the HUD to change the fill color. While you're here, try enabling the outline and increasing the width. Note how the corners of the outline are rounded when made very thick. We'll come back to that. Disable the outline and experiment with the feather amount. Undo that and try out roundness. Notice as you adjust the roundness parameter, a small handle at the top left of the shape moves. Drag it to change the roundness value directly in the canvas. Now set it back to 0. We'll come back to these other HUD parameters later. Let's see how we can manipulate the shape directly in the canvas. Just like any other layer or group in motion, we can drag on it to change its position. We can drag the rotation handle to rotate it, and we can drag a bounding box handle to change its scale. Hold down the Shift key to scale proportionally, and hold down the Option key to scale around the anchor point. Let's press Command-Z a few times to undo those changes. Shapes also have some unique properties that can be changed in the canvas. Right or Control-click on the shape to reveal the contextual menu. In addition to the standard tools available for all layers, like Transform 3D, Anchor Point, and Distort, there are a few tools specifically for shapes. Select Edit Points. Every shape is drawn by connecting lines to control points. With the Edit Points tool, you can adjust both the lines and the control points. You can drag a control point to change its position. Let's undo that. You can select multiple control points by either shift-selecting them or simply drag a marquee to select them. You can now move multiple points at the same time. Let's undo that as well. You can delete a control point by pressing the Delete key. A quick way to create a right triangle. Let's undo. You can also add control points by double-clicking on any line between two control points. Although I find this method a little tricky, and I prefer to Option-click on the line. Let's undo. To change the lines between control points, right or Control-click directly on a control point and select Smooth. Bezier handles appear, which allow you to adjust the curve through the control point. Hold down the Command key while dragging to adjust the length of both control points at the same time. Hold down the Option key to change the angle of each Bezier handle independently. Press Option again to keep the new angle locked. Right or Control-click on the end of a handle to align them once again. You can see how quickly you can create your own unique shapes with the Edit Points tool. Let's right-click on this control point and change it back to linear. You can also manipulate these control points in the inspector to place them precisely, and you don't even need the Edit Points tool to be active. Press Shift-S to return to the Select Transform tool. In the inspector, select the Properties tab, A fast way to get here is to press the F1 key. We can see that keyboard shortcut here in the Window menu. The Properties Inspector contains parameters that are available for any type of layer or group. Let's click the hooked arrow for the Transform properties to perfectly center our shape. Now select the Shape Inspector. This pane contains parameters that are unique to shapes. The first pane, Style, contains the same parameters we saw in the HUD for adjusting the fill and outline of the shape, plus some additional parameters. Enable the outline and increase the width using the slider all the way to 100. Just as we saw when using the HUD, the outline has rounded corners. By the way, you can go higher than 100 by dragging directly on the value field. Let's undo that. Now, use the inspector to change the joint parameter to square. Set the width to about 40. Notice that the next two panes, Stroke and Advanced, are grayed out and not selectable. We'll come back to those. Select the Geometry pane. Here, in the Control Points section, we can see and change the X and Y coordinates for every control point on the shape. For example, let's set every control point value to 100 pixels, keeping the negative values negative. You can use the Tab key to quickly move from one field to the next. The square should now be exactly 200 pixels on each side. Or is it? In the canvas, right-click and select Edit Points once again. Notice that the points are positioned in the middle of the outline. Since we set the outline width to 40, this square is actually 240 pixels on each side. If you want the shape to exactly match the control points, you would need to turn off the outline. Let's leave it on here and press Shift-S to return to the Select Transform tool. Two other important things to point out here. Back in the Geometry pane of the Shape Inspector, if you now increase the roundness value, which you could do in the HUD as well, both the fill and outline change together, even though we set the joint type to square. Set the value to 20. Second, if you change the scale of the shape, for example by dragging a bounding box handle in the canvas, notice how the control point values in the inspector do not change. They are independent of the scale changes. So if you're trying to set specific control point values for a shape, make sure its scale is set to 100%. We can use the Reset arrow in the Properties Inspector to do that here, which will also move the shape back to the center of the canvas. Okay, with these basic concepts for creating and manipulating a shape in the canvas, the HUD, and the inspector established, let's add some more shapes. First, press Command-S to save your work, name your project, select a location to save it, and press Save. A great use for shapes is to create a background. As you may already know, the canvas is actually transparent, which you can verify by selecting Transparent from the Channels pop-up menu at the top right of the canvas. One way to create a solid background is to choose Edit, Project Properties, and change the background pop-up menu to Solid. You can also change the color here. But using a shape opens up some other options. Let's set the background back to transparent. We're going to add a shape that fills the canvas, and to do that we need a little more room. We'll use a keyboard modifier, but first we need to make a change in System Preferences. From the Apple menu, choose System Preferences. Now select Spotlight. At the bottom, uncheck the Spotlight menu keyboard shortcut. Close the System Preferences window and return to Motion. Now hold down Command Spacebar and drag left to zoom back your view and make some room around the canvas. Then hold down just the spacebar and drag to pan your view as needed. Now once again select the Rectangle tool and draw a rectangle that covers the entire canvas. It doesn't matter if it's too big, it just needs to overlap all the edges. Press Escape to exit the tool, press Shift-Z to fit the canvas to the window, and then press Command left bracket to move this new layer beneath the smaller rectangle in the Layers list, which will move it below in the canvas. Rename it to Background. Return to the Shape Inspector, to the Style pane. Instead of filling the shape with a color, we can use the Fill Mode pop-up menu to fill it with a gradient. The Gradient Editor appears, where we can choose from a list of preset gradients. Try a few out. It's a little difficult to tell what these gradients will look like just by their names, so let's look at a way we can preview gradients before applying them. Go to the library. Select the Gradients category. Make sure you are in Icon View and use this button to adjust the size of the icons as desired. You can now see exactly what each gradient looks like before applying it. To apply one, just drag it onto the background shape layer in the Layers list, or drag it directly to the canvas. You aren't restricted to just these gradient presets. Return to the inspector and click the disclosure triangle next to the Gradient Editor. Along the bottom bar are a set of color tags. You can move them, remove them, and add them by clicking on the bar. A fast way to change the colors is to right-click on them. Or you can select a tag, click the color swatch, and use the OS X color picker to assign a color, perhaps one that you've saved. To save a color, drag from the bar down to this grid. You can save many colors here. Drag down here to expose all the wells. Let's close the color picker. You can also change the gradient type. Let's select Radial. Set the start values both to 0. Then turn off the top rectangle in the Layers list so we can see the full gradient. Rather than trying to adjust the gradient in the inspector, there's a very handy tool for doing so right in the canvas. Right-click in the canvas and select Edit Gradient. You can right-click on these color tags to change the colors. Then drag the end of the handle to increase the size of the inner color to make a nice, soft, vignetted background. To see the full control, you may now need to press Command Spacebar and drag left. Then press Shift-Z to fit the canvas back to the window. Press Shift-S to return to the Select Transform tool. Once you've created a gradient that you like, you can save it for future use. From the Gradients pop-up menu, choose Save Gradient. Give it a name, and click Save. Now select the Gradients pop-up menu again, and you'll see your new gradient has been added to the list in alphabetical order, with a space below it to make it stand out as a user-created preset. Return to the library, and you'll find your new preset here as well, also ordered alphabetically, with a small badge to indicate that it is a user preset. Notice, however, that the thumbnail of the user-created preset is a fixed design and does not show you the true gradient colors. However, if you select it, you can see the gradient in the preview window. Notice also that any saved presets are saved as linear gradients, even if you had set them to radial. Okay, let's turn on the foreground shape, select it, and use the HUD to adjust its colors to work well with the new background. Let's say we want to use this shape as a frame for a title, so it will need to be wider. Well, we could hold down the Option key and drag on a side bounding box handle to scale the box in Y in both directions at once, but notice that this approach scales the outline in a non-proportional and rather ugly way. Undo that. Instead, we can use another tool for making it rectangular and aligning it precisely. From the View pop-up menu at the top right of the canvas, select Grid. Take a note of the keyboard shortcut Command'. Click the View pop-up menu again and choose Rulers. Note its shortcut as well, Command-Shift-R. The rulers make it easier to see the center grid lines. Now go to the View menu at the top, as opposed to the View pop-up menu you were just using, and make sure Snap is enabled. Now select the Edit Points tool. With the grid, rulers, and snapping enabled, drag each control point 3 grid lines to the left and right of the center, snapping to the grid intersections. Then, go to the Shape Inspector, to the Geometry pane, to verify that the control point values are all nice round numbers. Adjust if needed. Press Shift-S to return to the Select Transform tool, then use the HUD to adjust the outline width to about 20 so it's not so dominant. Save your work. Let's add a few more shapes to the project. In the toolbar, click and hold on the Rectangle tool to reveal a pop-up menu of tools. Select the Circle tool. The keyboard shortcut for this tool is C. Position the crosshairs on the center grid lines, hold down both the Option and Shift keys, and drag out a circle. The Option key keeps the circle centered around the point where you started dragging, and the Shift key keeps it perfectly round. Press Escape to exit the tool. Press Command left bracket to move the circle below the rectangle, and then use the HUD to change the fill color, enable the outline, and increase the width. In the canvas, hold down the Shift and Option keys and drag a corner bounding box handle to adjust the scale of the circle to taste. To make sure it's centered, go to the Properties Inspector and set Position X and Y to 0. You don't want to click the Reset arrow this time because you've adjusted the scale of the shape. In the toolbar, now select the Line tool. Starting off the canvas to the left and in the middle vertically, hold down the Shift key and drag out a line across the canvas and off the right edge. Holding down the Shift key forces the line to be perfectly horizontal or vertical depending on the direction you drag. Press the Escape key to exit the tool. Notice in the Layers list that this shape has a different icon. This shape is actually a paint stroke. Drag it below the other two foreground shapes, or press Command left bracket twice. In the HUD, change its outline color to white by dragging the Fill color swatch onto the outline color swatch. Increase the width. Now select the circle and in the HUD, turn off the fill. Notice in the Layers list how its icon changes to match that of the line. It becomes a paint stroke. The key concept here is that any shape without a fill becomes a paint stroke. So paint strokes are just a subset of shapes. We'll come back to this idea later in more detail. Reselect the line in the Layers list. Although the line is perfectly horizontal, it may not be in the exact center of the canvas. So in the Properties Inspector, click the Reset arrow for the transform properties. Now in the Shape Inspector, in the Geometry pane, both Y values should be 0. With our basic design of 3 shapes completed, press Command apostrophe to turn off the grid and Shift Command R to turn off the rulers. You can add effects to a shape just like any other type of layer in Motion. Effects include filters, behaviors, and masks. Let's look at modifying shapes with a few filters. Go to the library and select the Filters category. While there are a large number of filters here, I found that only a handful of them are useful for shapes, but they are useful indeed. Choose the Stylize category. Locate Indent and drag it onto the rectangle in the Layers list. This filter creates a faux 3D bevel effect. It also darkens the face of the outline, so if you want to keep it pure white, use the HUD to increase the brightness value all the way. Experiment with the other parameters. In particular, softness has a big impact. To see how this filter would look on all 3 foreground shapes, select one in the Layers list, then Shift-select the others to select them all, and from the Object menu, choose Group to place the selected layers in a new group. Rename this group to Foreground Shapes. Now drag the Indent filter onto the Foreground Shapes group. Notice how the intersections of the shapes don't look very good. Drag the filter back to the rectangle shape. Then Option drag it to the other 2 shapes to create copies. That looks better. Another interesting filter for shapes is Extrude. Turn off the 3 indent filters. Go back to the library. Locate the Extrude filter in the same Stylize category. and drag it onto the rectangle. Use the on-screen control to adjust the angle and depth of the extrusion. Try dragging the extrude filter onto the foreground shapes group. This filter works well when applied to the group. In the HUD, try decreasing the back size. Then adjust the on-screen control to create a perspective effect. Now turn the indent filters back on to combine them with the extrude filter. The line now needs to be longer so we don't see its edges, so return to the Shape Inspector, to the Geometry pane, and drag in the 0.1 and 0.2 X value fields to extend the line off the canvas. That's an interesting look. Let's try a few more. Turn off the extrude and indent filters. Select the foreground shapes group. This time, to add a filter, click the Filters button in the toolbar and choose Distortion, Twirl. Adjust the position and rotation of the on-screen control. Adjust the amount parameter in the HUD. Try turning the extrude filter back on. By combining filters like this, you can come up with all kinds of interesting possibilities. And of course, all these parameters can be animated to change over time. Okay, one more. With the foreground shapes group selected and the filters turned off, click the Filters menu in the toolbar and choose Distortion, Wave. There's no on-screen control for this filter, so in the HUD, check the Vertical checkbox. In the Layers list, turn off the rectangle and the circle. The filter collapses around the line, so go to the Group Inspector and check the Fixed Resolution checkbox. In the HUD, adjust the amplitude and the wavelength. With just one line shape and a filter, we have a nice little sine wave. Let's animate it. In the HUD, right-click directly on the word Offset. From the pop-up menu, choose Add Parameter Behavior, Rate. Press the spacebar to start playback. In the HUD, Option-click a few times on the slider to the left of the ball for the rate value to change the value in small increments. Set it to about -6. Now, this animation might look better if we could see the end of the line, so select the line layer, go to the Shape Inspector, to the Geometry pane, and set the 0.2 X value to 0. Very nice. Just for fun, turn on the Twirl filter. Okay, that's a little crazy. Press Command Z a few times to turn the Twirl filter back off and make the line go off screen again. Then turn off the Wave filter and turn the rectangle and circle shapes back on. Stop playback and move the playhead back home. Let's finish off this composition by adding some text. Select the Text tool in the toolbar, click in the rectangle shape, and type Shapes. Press Escape to exit the Text tool and use the HUD to select a font that you like. I'm using Korataki. Adjust the size and position to fit the rectangle. Now select the foreground shapes group and use the HUD to enable the drop shadow. Give it some blur. Then right-click in the canvas, select the Drop Shadow tool, and drag to reposition it. Press Shift-S to return to the Select Transform tool. With the group still selected, return to the Group Inspector and turn off Fixed Resolution so that the Extrude filter, if enabled, will extend the line off the screen. Select the rectangle shape and in the Shape Inspector, in the Style pane, change its fill mode to Gradient. Change the gradient to radial and adjust to taste. We now have a nice little title composition created completely from shapes and one text layer whose looks can be changed quite dramatically by enabling the applied filters. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to draw and save shapes, create some more animation, and see how shapes and masks can be used together.